Hello and welcome back to the course on art programming. And today we're talking about the aesthetics layer of our visualization. And actually we're going to get an introduction to ggplot, the main function of the ggplot2 library. So let's go and check it out. So this is what we did in the previous tutorial. We talked about factors and we prepared our dataset. Now let's start talking about aesthetics. All right, we're going to first load the library, or the package, the correct term is load the package using the library function ggplot2, and the function that we're going to be using is ggplot. Previously we used qplot, and qplot is kind of like a quick plot. That's what the Q stands for. It's a very quick tool. ggplot is the actual heavy artillery function of this library, and we're going to start learning it today. All right, first you want to, just like with qplot, supply the data. So you want to say data equals movies. Then you want to create the aesthetics, and this is where things start getting a bit more complicated, but don't worry, throughout this section you will definitely practice this so many times that it will become intuitive. All right, so you got to type in the function called AES for aesthetics, and that is the function that allows you to set aesthetics. And as we remember, aesthetics is how your data maps to what you want to see. It's not even the geometry layer yet. We're still, so if I go back here, we're still here. So these first two layers are insufficient to actually see something. We'll need the geometries layer. So let's go ahead and first tell ggplot how we want to map the data. We want to say, well, let's go ahead and start by creating that plot that the CEO wanted, the critic rating on the bottom and on axis and the audience rating on the top one. So we want to say x equals critic rating. And now we can actually not say movies $ critic rating because ggplot knows that we're working with this data set. And then here we're going to go y equals audience rating. All right, so what happens if I run this line? Nothing happens. Well, let's have a look here. You can see that an empty plot has appeared with nothing on it. And why is that? Well, we did say critic rating. We want critic rating on the bottom and audience rating on the top, or on the left. That's right, but where are the dots or the squares or the triangles or the lines? Well, that's exactly it. Our ggplot doesn't know what we want. It doesn't know, do we want lines or do we want dots or do we want bubbles? So we've got to tell it, right? So we're actually now going to run a bit ahead of ourselves. We're going to introduce the geometry layer, but it's a necessity because otherwise we won't see anything. So let's go ahead and just copy that. And this time we'll say plus, right? And let's actually say here, add geometry so we remember what's going on. Plus, and here we're going to say geom underscore point, right? So if we run this now, there we go. Now we can see something good. And by the way, it's convenient to add new layers with this plus sign when you just put them on a new line. So keep the plus on this line, so R doesn't run this line by itself. It expects a new line, and then you just add a new layer on every new line. It's just more convenient like that. So like this, I can either highlight both lines and run it, or I can run line by line, and R will wait until the end. And so there we go. That's our critics rating and audience ratings. Okay, beautiful. So now what are we going to do? Let's add more aesthetics. And let's remember, aesthetics are things that we can see, right? Now we have the geometry. Now we can assign more parameters of that geometry. And what is a parameter of this geometry? Another one is, of course, color. So let's do that. Let's add color. All right, I'm going to just copy this so we don't have to retype it. And here I'm going to say comma. Here I'm going to say color equals genre. Yeah, makes sense, right? So if I run these two lines, you'll see that the plot has been colored by the genre of the movie, and we've actually got a legend. So ggplot is actually very smart. We don't have to create the legend on our own. It gets added automatically. All right, and another thing is, like, because we're running out of space, I'm just going to put this on a new line as well. And because of this comma, R is going to know that this line's not finished, so it's going to go and wait until we run all of them. All right, and now we're going to add another aesthetic, which is size. Size is another thing we can see, right? And all of this is possible because we know, or R knows, what geometry we want. And now we can just keep adding things on. So we're going to say size equals, let's also say genre, right? Let's have a look at that. So what you'll see here is that they're colored by, or the size is selected by genre, and you've got a legend here, which combines color and genre, which are very smart. But you've got a warning at the bottom saying using size for a discrete variable is not advised. Makes sense, right? Because That's very misleading to the eye. Why would thriller be bigger than action? What is the logic behind that? So we're going to replace that. We're going to say add size, let's say better way. And here we're going to say, instead of genre, let's just say budget. Budget millions is our variable. And if I run that, okay, that makes more sense, right? So bigger bubbles represent movies that had a bigger budget. And smaller bubbles are smaller budgets, and then color is genre, and then you've got the critic rating here and the audience rating. And you can already tell some very interesting insights from this visualization on its own. You can see that, all right, so if our horizontal or our diagonal goes through this, you can see that the audience is definitely more forgiving to movies, and they only kind of line up together with the critics over here. So the audience, the bubbles are always above the diagonal, mostly above the diagonal, and it means the audience is like rates the movies higher. And you can tell other things from here as well. Like it's a bit hard because, and we'll definitely make it better throughout this section, but it's already a good starting point. So here I wanted to say something like, I wanted to say this is number 1 that we're going to put into our visualization, but I'll just keep it like that. But remember that we will improve it. Further down in the section, as we learn new things, we'll see how we can actually improve this chart, but it's already a great start. And that's it for today. In the next tutorial, we will learn another new skill with ggplot. And go ahead and practice with that. Try fiddling around with the ggplot function and changing the variables or aesthetics here. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, happy coding. Hello and welcome back to the course on R programming. And today we're going to talk about plotting with layers. So I've got the check mark set on geometries because we are going to be talking about geometries, and we will see how you can layer geometries on top of each other and what plotting with layers actually means in R. And let's dive straight into it. All right, so this is where we left off last time. We created this beautiful, beautiful visualization. And now let's move on to the next point. All right, so let's remember what we talked about here. Here we said, what do we need from here? Well, what did we do? We added this aesthetics, right? We said, okay, what's X going to be? What's Y going to be? Color, genre, and so on. And then we said plus geom points. So what's going on with this plus? What is actually going on? Well, the thing is that in ggplot, the way it's designed, every time you want to add a layer, you literally have to add it to the object you're creating. And that's right, you are creating an object, and I can prove it to you. So if we just take this code, right, and if I say P for plot, and then I copy this code, right, and now I run these 2 lines, you'll see that nothing changed, so nothing appeared. But what did happen is we just created an object. Let me drag this down so you can see object P, list of 9. So we haven't talked about lists. That is coming later on in the course. But if I open it up now, if I unlock it over here, you can see that this is a huge object. It has the data frame. So actually the data is physically copied into this object. And be careful of that. That's important to remember, because if you refresh the data, then your plot won't refresh until you recreate the object. And we'll talk more about that further down. So you can see that the data frame is in here. Then it's got some layers, scales, add, clone, find, all of these unknown to us things. Oh, here it's got colors, so there are aesthetics. So, and you can see the word mapping, which we will also talk about in an upcoming tutorial. But that's exactly what aesthetics do. They map variables to our aesthetics. And so there's lots of things going on here. And yep, we created an object. And so now from this point onwards, we're actually going to work with layers or plots as they are objects. So what I can do now is I can just type in P, and if I run this line, that creates or visualizes that object P. Of course, we don't see anything because we haven't. What have we done? We haven't set the geometry yet. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's say P plus geom underscore point. I run this line. You can see that I've got the object, and this is the important concept of ggplot. So I've got this object, which is the foundation of my plot, the starting layer. And what it has the data and it's got the aesthetics. And now on top of it, I can put the layer I want. So I can say, what was this? This was a points. Or I can use the same object and I can say, I want lines this time. Let's say p plus, can you guess what it'll be? Geom underscore line, correct. So brackets, and now if I run this line, voila. I know, it doesn't make sense at all, this line, so completely meaningless plot, but the concept stays the same. We just used p, so the object, and overlaid it, which already contains, it's supercharged with the data, the aesthetics, so x, y, color, and size, and now we're just overlaying a geometry. And as you can see here, the lines, some of them are thinner, some of them are wider, and that is because we've got the size aesthetic, and also the colors are different, and so on. So that is what plotting with layers is. And actually, taking it a step even further, we can say multiple layers, right? We can say p plus geom underscore point, and then plus geom underscore line. How about that? If we run that, you'll see that there are dots and then the lines. And of course you can't really see the dots here because the lines are on top of them. So let's take that and we'll change the order. We'll just say p plus geom line, then plus geom point. If I run that, now you can see the dots better because they're on top of the lines. And once again, even though this is a completely meaningless visualization, the concept remains the same. We're plotting with layers, layer on top of a layer on top of a layer, and that's how ggplot works. So go ahead and try experimenting with that, see what you can come up with, and maybe change around the p object, and just give it a go and kind of get used to the concept of layers, because we'll be using it a lot throughout the section, and moreover, it'll be very important in your work with R going forward. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, happy coding. Hello and welcome back to the course on R programming. And today we're moving back a step. We're going back to aesthetics, and we'll be talking about this layer of our visualization process. And that's because we want to learn about overriding aesthetics. All right, let's see how this works. So here we've got what we created last time, the beautiful, meaningless visualization. And what did we learn? We learned about plotting with layers. So we learned that we're creating objects, and that then we're adding layers and layers and layers to create the visualization. So let's quickly recap on that. Let's create an object, let's say Q. So we'll just keep incrementing these numbers so that we use new ones all the time. ggplot data equals movies, aesthetics x equals critic rating, and then y equals audience rating. Then we want color equals genre, and then we want size equals budget millions. All right, so we're going to create this object now, and there we go. We've just added this Q object, and now we're going to say add geom layer, right? So we're going to say Q plus geom underscore point. Run that. There we go. So that's the visualization that we've seen before. Now, what we're learning today is that, well, as you can see, this visualization, or the geometry that we're using, geom point, it's inheriting the aesthetics from this object, from object Q, right? So it's saying, okay, what aesthetics does Q have? Q has X, Y, color, and size. I'm going to take all of those and I'm going to assume those aesthetics. So that's why it is plotted on this axis, That's why these dots are plotted in the spots where they are. Then the colors are assigned to them like that, and also the sizes. So, but what we can do is we can override aesthetics. And so we can say, geom point, we want a specific aesthetic to be different to the one that you have here in the base of this visualization. So let's look at that, overriding. Writing aesthetics. All right, how do we do that? We say Q plus geom point. Now, instead of just running it, inside these brackets, you can specify more aesthetics. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll say aesthetics. So you can see actually here mapping, and that's what we're doing. We're saying aesthetics. In here, we're going to say, let's change the size. Let's say size, we don't want it to be budget millions anymore. We want it to be critic rating, for instance, because that's one of the variables we have, and that's just what we want to plot. So if we run that, you can see that now the visualization is different because the size that we had in Q has been overridden by this new mapping of size. So this overrides what we had in there. So it is specific to geom points. So all of the points now are greater as you go to the right. They're greater because that is critic rating increasing. And now you can see that the budget has no effect on the size. Okay, so that's example 1. And actually we're going to say here example 1. Let's do another example. Let's say example 2. And let's say we want to override color. So Q plus, and we'll just take this. And inside here, we want to say color. And instead of color being genre, let's say budget millions. So if I run this, you'll see now the color is different. The color is based on the budget rather than the genre. So the color is similar to the size of the bubbles. And by the way, this, which brings us to this point that I wanted to make, is that if I just run Q plus geom point underscore by itself, run like that, you'll see that we've got that original plot that we had. Why is that? Well, because even though we're overriding, we're not modifying the object. We're not modifying Q in any way. So Q still stays as it was. We're just, for this specific plot, we're saying we want to override the aesthetic. But then Q itself, it's not changing. So whenever we stop overriding the values, then they revert back to their original. So let's say here, Q remains the same. Yep, so we're not changing the object itself. All right, so what else can we override? Here I wanted to also show you that we can override even X and Y. So some people get a bit afraid, like, oh wow, those are, you know, framework of this visualization, they are the X and Y coordinates, but they are aesthetics just as color or as size. Like in terms of, in a data perspective, X is no different to size or color. It's always just conveying data in a different way, in a different shape or format. So we're going to say Q plus geom underscore point, and we're going to override the X axis. We're going to say X this time is going to be budget millions, right? So if we run that, you can see that the plot is different. So as you go to the right, the budget increases, and here we've got the audience rating. So as you can see, audience rating doesn't really depend that much on budget. Maybe at the highest level of budget over here, over 150 million, maybe they, you know, it's very hard to get a poor rating from the audience. But otherwise, you know, audience doesn't discriminate. And what you will notice is if you look very carefully, and if we zoom in over here, you'll see that it still says critic rating. And that's kind of like a thing in ggplot that it will still, even though we've overridden the aesthetic, it still keeps the old name. It's very easy to fix, and we'll explore this further in the course. All you have to do is just say plus, and then here say xlab before, because it's the x-axis, and here just say budget millions, and you can say dollar or something like that. So if you run that, you can see that the axis has been updated successfully. Okay, and let's have a look at one more example. Remember the plot where we had example 4, where we had 2 visualizations together. So this one, let's just take that one, or let's take this one. This one looked a bit better. So if we take that one and we say, instead of PQ, if we run that, then we've got that plot that we're used to. But now what we want to do, let's reduce the size of these lines because they're too thick. We can't see the dots, right? Reduce line size. And now let's say geom line, and in here we'll just say size equals 1. If I run that, you'll see that the size has changed. It's thinner. That's pretty good, right? And if you're very attentive, you're probably now saying, Kirill, what just happened? You forgot the aesthetic function. And that's right. Over here, I didn't type in aesthetic, right? So I didn't say aesthetic and something inside. I just said size equals 1. And that's a new thing. That's a new thing that we're going to learn. It's called mapping versus setting. And as you can see here, we're mapping variables to aesthetics. Here, we're actually just setting aesthetics. And we'll talk more about mapping versus setting in the next tutorial. It's going to be a fun thing to learn and very powerful tool as well. And for now, I will leave you to play around with what we learned today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, happy coding! Hello and welcome back to the course on art programming. And in today's tutorial, we're still talking about aesthetics. I know it's been a couple of tutorials, but aesthetics is a very important topic and we really want to learn it well so that we can later create very powerful visualizations. And moreover, today we're talking about a very important topic inside a very important topic, which is mapping versus setting. So I think it is worthwhile to devote some time to it so it settles very well in our minds. So let's go to our studio. And before we move on to mapping versus setting, I wanted to say that this chart that we created over here with the budget, that is going to be our second chart in our deliverable. So let's go ahead and run it. And it looks pretty interesting because budget, it's showing us that budget doesn't really affect the rating that the audience will give. So it doesn't matter, do you invest a lot of money on a movie or a little bit of money, there are other factors that affect audience rating rather than budget. So I think it's an important insight that we want to convey. So we're going to export the image by clicking this button and clicking Save As. Here we're going to say what size we want, 1280, 720, update preview, and let's go ahead and save that. And now I've actually prepared a presentation with 6 slides. This is going to be our deliverable. And we'll copy it as the second plot because we want to leave the first place for the plot that the CEO requested. All right, so there's our first chart. That's a great start. All right, and now let's move on to mapping versus setting. So first thing that we're going to do is start with a new letter, R, and then we'll say ggplot, same thing, data equals movies, then aesthetics. Let's give it some aesthetics, X. So basically, let's recreate what we've already done. It's always good to practice. Y equals audience rating. All right, so if I run that, that's our R object. And now what I want to do is I want to say R plus, let's give it some geometry, geom underscore point. If I run that, we remember this black plot. So just basically black dots. All right, how do we now add it, give it some color? So let's do that. Add color. There are 2 ways we can add color to this plot. Number 1 is by mapping. And this is what we've done so far. This is actually the hard bit. So setting is easier, and it's good that we started with mapping. It's a bit harder. But now we know it. R plus geom underscore point. Whoop, not path, point. And here we want to say aesthetic. And inside we want to say color equals genre. Right? So if we run that, we've got some colored points. Good. Now, let's look at the second way. The second way is actually setting. This is the new way, which we touched on in the previous tutorial. Let's look at it. So R plus, same thing, geom point. And here, instead of saying aesthetic, we're just going to say the color. We're just going to say color equals, and we'll say dark green. So if you run that, you'll see that the points now are actually dark green. All right. Now, this would be an error. If I would say, we'll get back to what we did just now, but I just want to show you error. If you try to set the color while using aesthetic. So if I was to do this, and then instead of genre, if I said dark green. So if I did that, if I run that, you'll see that the points are actually kind of pink or salmon color. And there's a legend moreover. This shouldn't be a legend. And what that is what's happening there is that even though you think that you're setting the color to dark green, you're actually mapping it to this new variable that are things you're creating. So very important to remember that if you just want to set a color, then you don't use aesthetics. If you want to map a color to a variable, then you use the function aesthetic. And so I know it can be a bit confusing, so I'm just going to comment this out so it's not in our way. It can be a bit confusing between the two because in both cases you're setting color, right? And what is color? Well, color is an aesthetic, right? It's an aesthetic on your chart. So in this case, you're mapping color to a variable. In this case, you are setting a color, which is an aesthetic, to a physical color. So you're using the actual meaning of this word, dark green. It can be a bit confusing, but the best way I would say to remember it is that it's harder to map, right? So attaching one variable or something, a color to a variable, is generally a more complex process than just setting it. So that's how to remember it. So something more complex requires this function aesthetic, so requires the help of this function, and something simpler like setting doesn't require that. So I know it might be a bit confusing right now, but let's practice a little bit more, and I'm sure that throughout this section we will have so much practice that by the end of it you will be very comfortable with all of this. So mapping, let's do another one. So number one is going to be mapping. We're going to say r plus geom point, and actually feel free to use any of your own suggestions for examples. I'm going to use budget millions, so I'm going to use size for budget millions, which we used before, right? There you can see the size has changed. That's good. And now let's try setting. Here we're going to say r plus geom underscore point, and here we're going to say size equals 10. Aha, very big, very nice, exactly what we wanted. Now let's see what happens. Once again, we're going to check this out, the error. I just want to show you that it is very important to remember these things. So r plus geom underscore point, and here, let's say I had forgotten that I don't need to use aesthetics for setting. I said aesthetics, and then I said size equals 10. What you'll see is the size is a bit bigger than in this case, but that's not 10. As we saw, 10 is much bigger. That is just because R is looking at this 10 that you're supplying as if it were a category, right? As if it were like a factor variable, and it's saying, oh, okay, that's a category. I'm going to create a legend. So everybody in category 10 is going to get this specific size, which looks like a 3 or a 4 or something like that. So basically, it can be very misleading. And if you by accident forget, then you might end up in a bit of trouble. So always remember, if you want to set something, don't use the aesthetic function. If you want to map something, use the aesthetic function. It's as simple as that. And at the same time, even though it being such a simple concept that you can either set or map aesthetics that you see on your chart, it gives you a lot of flexibility, as you can imagine. So you can either color something using a variable, or you can just color something using a color. You can make your charts prettier. You can make them more vibrant. You can change the sizes. So if something's too small, you can change all of the sizes without even having to map to a variable. It really gives you a lot of control over your visualizations. So that's what we're going to be practicing throughout this section. And that brings us also to the end of today's tutorial. I highly encourage you to play around with this. So just spend a couple of minutes on practicing setting versus mapping. We've got a lot of variables in our data set, so try a couple of different ones, because it is an important concept that needs to settle down in our minds very well. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, happy coding.